Good afternoon to everyone. First, I'd like to thank Professor Xiaohua Zhan for inviting me to present my work here today. In this presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of the research and analysis from my forthcoming book, titled Along the Integral Margin. The book, as was mentioned, will be coming out next year. The book is an ethnographic study of the livelihoods of residents at a squatter settlement in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Yangon, Myanmar's former capital. You can see a photo of the settlement in front of you. So for this book, I conducted ethnographic research in and around this settlement for over 10 months, from 2016 to late 2019. The book is largely a critique of the political economic transformations that played out under what has been widely referred to as Myanmar's transition to a liberal democratic order. This so-called transition began in February 2011 with the inauguration of President U Thein Sein, head of the country's first elected government in almost 50 years. Subsequently, in 2015, the electoral victory of Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, or NLD, appeared to further consolidate this political and economic transformation. So this was the context in which I conducted my research. Now, in January of this year, I submitted to the publisher the final revised version of the book manuscript. But as you will be aware, within a month, the Burmese military had seized power in a coup, arrested most senior members of the elected government, and declared a state of emergency.
什么菜没有了？裙带那也可以。
So-called transition was over. I want to argue, however, that it remains imperative in this post-coup moment to revisit the political economy of transition-era Myanmar. This is something that I do in the book through ethnographic accounts of the lives and livelihoods of individuals residing at the settlement that I've mentioned to you. So the experiences of these individuals tell us much about Myanmar's recent political economic history and suggest important critiques of the pre-coup political order. But what is more, I'd like to argue here that there's a relationship between certain post-coup developments and the political economy of Myanmar's so-called transition to a liberal capitalist order. This is because the transformations of the transition era established, or at least exacerbated, the precarious conditions faced by ordinary people across the country. And under the COVID-19 pandemic and the post-coup economic and political crisis, this pre-existing precarity has only worsened. Now, before I get into a discussion of my research, I'd like to first note the tremendous significance of the civil disobedience movement, or CDM, that emerged in Myanmar in response to the February 1st military coup. Many of you have likely seen images and videos of protesters across Myanmar courageously and creatively opposing the reimposition of direct military rule in the country. The military has responded to these protests with brutal violence. Since the coup, the military and police have killed over 1,250 civilian protesters, activists, and bystanders, and have arrested or charged almost 10,000 people, according to recent figures. Of course, this sort of violence is not new. In particular, ethnic nationalities living in upland areas outside of the central lowlands have long faced indiscriminate and brutal violence by the Myanmar military. Nevertheless, developments since the coup raise some important questions. So let me sketch two notable post-coup developments. First, in the early days of the post-coup protest movement, images of re-imprisoned state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi were near ubiquitous, as you can see in this photo. So too was the color red of Aung San Suu Kyi's ousted National League for Democracy. Soon, however, alternative political positions among the protesters became evident. Many protesters began wearing black, symbolizing opposition to the military, rather than simply the red of the NLD. And students at Yangon University had put up a large banner reading in English, "There is no supreme savior," and this image was subsequently circulated widely on social media. Now, on the one hand, this position reveals a sober awareness that no foreign country or the UN is likely to decisively intervene to oust the military. But this statement that you see here also signals a rejection of an elitist domestic politics that privileges Aung San Suu Kyi, or any other NLD leader for that matter, as being individually capable or willing to push the country towards a more democratic and less oppressive political arrangement. Now, a similar banner from the protests reads, "Power to the people." Again, this suggests a critique of the rather elitist pre-coup political arrangement. Now, the second phenomenon that I'd like to highlight here concerns internal migrants residing in the industrial zones around Yangon. So this is the areas where I conducted research beginning in 2016. Now, following the coup, factory workers, who are overwhelmingly young women in their late teens and 20s, who have migrated to Yangon from elsewhere in the country, took a lead role in catalyzing the wider protest movement. It was in large part the importance of these women factory workers and their unions in the protest movement that led the military to target them in the post-coup crackdown. For example, at the end of February, the military junta declared the most prominent of Myanmar's trade unions and labor organizations unlawful. This included the Yeonju Workers Association, with which I worked closely while doing research for this project. The junta then declared martial law over several industrial townships, including the one where I was residing while conducting research for this project. Then on March 14th, security forces responded to protesting factory workers by killing at least 58 people in the industrial township of Hlantaya. Many trade union leaders have also been arrested. This includes people like Dom Yomyue, Director of Solidarity Trade Union of Myanmar, at whose office I taught weekly English lessons for most of 2019. Dom Yomyue was only released from prison a few weeks ago after almost 5 months in detention. Now, at the same time that the military and police were cracking down on worker activists, and as many factory workers continued to strike and protest the coup, many factories shut down. According to one report, by late June 2021, over 1 million factory workers had lost their jobs, due largely to factory closures following the coup. Since then, many of these factories have reopened, but factory owners have used the conditions of military rule to suppress wages. So while the official minimum wage in Myanmar is 4,800 kyat per day, or about $3.70 Singaporean, many factories have unilaterally imposed a day rate of 3,600 kyat, or about $2.70 Singaporean. And to be clear, this is $2.70 for a total of 8 hours of work. These developments since the coup have exacerbated a situation that was already dire due to COVID-19 related factory closures and declines in orders over the preceding year. So it's in this post-coup context that I propose we revisit the political economy of Myanmar's so-called transition. I'd like to argue that a more critical grasp of the transition's political economy helps us to make sense of the current precarity of factory workers and others around Yangon since the coup. It also helps us understand the critical stance of many radical students and activists in Myanmar today who, while strongly rejecting the reassertion of direct military rule, are also highly critical of the earlier NLD-dominated political arrangement. So let's return for a moment to the early years of the transition. I'd like to emphasize 2 things here. First, the role of foreign governments, organizations, and international financial institutions in seeking to shape Myanmar's political economic restructuring. And second, the ideological convergence of capitalist modernization discourse with the ongoing dispossession of rural dwellers in Myanmar. Now, in 2013, the World Bank began channeling through Myanmar's Ministry of Planning and Finance consecutive loans in the range of a couple $100 million each. These loans were conditional. For example, with these loans, the World Bank was able to pressure the Myanmar government into letting the World Bank's International Financial Corporation draft the 2016 Investment Act, which eviscerated restrictions on foreign investment and granted substantial privileges to foreign investors. And in 2017, the World Bank agreed to inject a further $200 million into the national budget on the condition that the government implement a comprehensive macroeconomic stability and fiscal resilience program. The agenda set out a project of structural adjustment aimed at eliminating, quote, binding constraints to private investment, the outcome of which, as part of a political and budgetary transition, was to be a proliferation of, quote, good jobs, meaning an increase in well-remunerated formal employment with rights and benefits as prescribed by law. Undergirding this narrative has been an assumption, which the World Bank has made explicit, that by eradicating constraints on private investment, the ensuing dynamism of capital would shepherd the country's largely rural population out of low productivity agrarian livelihoods and into good formal sector jobs in urban manufacturing and services. The development agenda derived from this premise has consequently privileged owners of capital over the country's proletarian and peasant majority, the aim being to insert Myanmar into global commodity chains as a foreign investment-driven, low-wage, low-value-added extractivist export economy. Simply put, the development paradigm that the World Bank and Asian Development Bank pushed on Myanmar during the transition was a neoliberal package recalling the structural adjustment programs previously imposed elsewhere in the global south. The result, in rural areas, has been widespread land confiscation that intensified with the start of the transition a decade ago. Coercive land confiscation, as well as loss of land through market mechanisms, intensified with the start of the transition. By one estimate, as of 2013, 5.3 million hectares of land, most of it simply confiscated from rural smallholders, was leased out to private corporations and individuals. Intertwined with these processes, mechanization significantly reduced the demand for agricultural wage labor, and rural indebtedness also increased significantly. In response to these pressures, many rural dwellers migrated to industrial zones around Yangon and elsewhere, as well as to mining sites and coastal fishing towns. Other individuals migrated to neighboring countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. In Thailand, they often found employment at below the legal minimum wage at workplaces that were in violation of local labor laws. And I should say that my first book was about the situation of Myanmar migrants working in the Mae Sot industrial zone on the Thai-Myanmar border. So, to restate, the World Bank and other aligned actors promoted a familiar narrative of capitalist modernization, and a neoliberal one at that, which was given the label of a transition. The promise was an old one, a shift from farm to factory, peasant to wage labor. As I've said, this development agenda aimed to insert Myanmar into global commodity chains as a foreign investment-driven, low-wage, low-value-added extractivist export economy. However, what this narrative leaves out is the widespread opposition within Myanmar to the harmful dynamics of this development process. Over the past decade, there have been widespread struggles by smallholder farmers across Myanmar against the dispossession of their land by military and military-aligned actors. The most prominent example of this was the protests of villagers at Lebanon in Sagaing region, who were dispossessed of their land to make way for a copper mine under a joint venture between Myanmar's Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited and China's Wanbao Mining Copper Limited. More generally, however, as my colleague at NTU, Xiaohua Zhan, has written about in the case of China, under contemporary precarious conditions, retaining access to rural land has in many countries become ever more important for livelihood security among peasants and semi-proletarianized migrant workers. In Indonesia, Tanya Murray Lee has argued along similar lines in her critique of corporate plantations that have displaced rural dwellers across the country. And in Thailand, Jonathan Riggs and others have argued that access to rural land has become central to intergenerational social reproduction, even as younger people migrate to urban areas for waged employment. So I'm raising in this presentation a critique of an enduring narrative of capitalist modernization, advanced by the World Bank, among others, that would legitimate the expulsion of peasants from their land in the name of economic efficiency, while disregarding the extremely precarious conditions that dispossessed rural to urban migrants subsequently confront. The extreme precarity that such individuals encounter upon migrating to industrial centers around Yangon or abroad to Thailand, for example, has become especially evident since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and even more so since the February coup. When COVID-19 happened, an initial shortage of supplies from China led to factory closures and a loss of 10,000 to 15,000 jobs in February 2020. By September 2020, 223 factories had filed for closure, temporary closure, or redundancy following a government-mandated lockdown. Meanwhile, factory employers used the pretext of COVID-19 disruption to fire unionized workers en masse, while police intervened to break up strikes and arrest organizers. With no effective social safety net in the country, dismissed factory workers have been struggling under the pandemic, taking on further debt, reducing food consumption, and in some cases taking on sex work to support their families. And all of this was before the military coup. However, even before COVID, affected individuals in the industrial zones around Yangon were already dealing with a very high level of economic precarity and general livelihood uncertainty. This is something that the World Bank and other advocates of the development model that I've outlined have glossed over. For example, a 2016 World Bank report on internal migration in Myanmar acknowledges landlessness as a key push factor in forming rural outmigration. However, the World Bank continues to ideologically construe formal urban wage labor as the primary motivation for rural-urban migration. And the 2016 report on migration avoids mentioning widely documented patterns of land confiscation by military and corporate actors and the widespread struggles of rural dwellers who have been protesting this dispossession. It has thus been left to civil society organizations to trace this relationship between outmigration on the one hand and, on the other, land confiscation at the hands of military and business actors. This process of violent dispossession in the countryside underpins precarious urban wage labor around Yangon and elsewhere in the country. What is more, rural dwellers who have migrated to Yangon have been effectively priced out of the city's expensive formal housing market. Most such individuals have therefore set up residence in informal dwellings along the city's industrial periphery. There are at present close to 500,000 individuals residing at hundreds of informal settlements around Yangon. In my research, I focused on one such settlement, which I am calling here Yadna. This settlement had approximately 1,000 households and 4,000 residents. Residents of this site are mostly former rural dwellers who migrated to Yangon between 2009 and 2014. Most of these individuals migrated to Yangon from the Irrawaddy Delta, Bago region, and northern Yangon region. The earliest of such arrivals were able to build dwellings of bamboo and dini palm on open land. However, as space filled up, later residents were compelled to informally purchase or rent squatter dwellings from earlier arrivals. These settlements are informal in the sense that residents have no legal property ownership documents. They thus face a constant threat of eviction. And the municipal government does not provide any public infrastructure like water, electricity, sanitation, or drainage. So this is the political economic context of rural to urban migration in Myanmar that underlies the precarious situation of the individuals whose livelihoods are researched. As a contrast to the World Bank's claim that rural to urban migrants have obtained good formal sector jobs, I'd like to discuss here some of the labor arrangements in which these individuals have actually been engaged. My argument, in brief, is that while the World Bank and other development actors argue that rural to urban migrants in Myanmar are able to obtain good formal sector jobs, my research suggests that, by and large, this is not the case. Instead, for the most part, the internal migrants on whom I focused have ended up in various labor arrangements that are excluded by law, or at least in practice, from formal labor protections. This work includes unwaged child labor, as well as violently unfree arrangements in the offshore raft fishing industry. What the World Bank's erroneous claim about good formal sector jobs does is legitimate a process of violent dispossession in the countryside and a flawed development agenda more broadly. So with that said, let me turn now to some of the arrangements in which Yadna's residents labored. Now, my aim here, and my aim in the larger book, is to consider in detail what sorts of labor arrangements rural to urban migrants have actually ended up in. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance that I'm going to shift my tone here. I'm going to shift to a more fine-grained ethnographic narrative as I tell the stories of some of the individuals from Yadna and the labor in which they are engaged. So, let us first consider Uncle Win and the frustrations that he recounted to me. Now, when we spoke, Uncle Win was not at all pleased. "This isn't meager work," the old man insisted, lugging a bucket of water back from the communal pump. The work he spoke of, the work he was now undertaking, was the care of 3 pigs he kept in a makeshift pen across from his home in the Yadna squatter settlement. On top of visiting neighbors each day in search of leftover rice and curry to use as pig feed, Uncle Win had to bathe these animals at least 3 times a day just to keep their temperatures down. Being CP pigs, a high-value breed engineered by the Thai agro-industrial conglomerate Charun Pokphand, they were particularly susceptible to heat-induced illness. If Uncle Win failed to bathe them as required, they might pass out, even die. Uncle Win's dilemma was that the largest of his 3 pigs was less than 50 kilograms. He had hoped to wait until the swine was at least 80 kilograms before selling. Unfortunately, Uncle Win's debt was coming due in a matter of weeks. He had somehow imagined that he might get 220,000 chat for the animal, which would have covered the arrears plus interest that his absentee landlord was demanding as debt, a penalty for Uncle Win having missed his rent 2 months earlier. But the slaughterhouse purchasing agent who had visited the settlement the day before had offered a mere 150,000 chat. Uncle Win was indignant, and it was not just about the labor. Having invested so much care in these pigs, he explained as he showered them with scoopfuls of water, he now felt a sense of attachment, daiyōzen, to the animals. How could he go sell his largest on the cheap? What is more, Uncle Win suspected that the purchasing agent, deft at recognizing and manipulating financial duress, knew of his debt, having likely inquired into the matter with one of Uncle Win's more spiteful neighbors. Given the circumstances, Uncle Win's plan was to step up his waste collection activities, by which he could earn 4,000 to 5,000 chat, not a lot, this is per day, but hopefully enough to allow him and his wife to hold out for a better offer on the pig. Now, all planning aside, when the purchasing agent returned 10 days later, Uncle Win, by now distraught over the thought of potential eviction in less than a week, dropped his price by a quarter. The agent, perhaps smelling a fire sale, lowered his own offer in turn. This was too much. Uncle Win contacted his landlord and implored her to reschedule his debt. Yes, full repayment could be deferred, she offered, but for an additional 40% monthly interest. Either that or he sell the hog. It was not ideal, but the arrangement would allow Uncle Win to hold on to the animal for the time being. In the end, when he did sell the pig a month later, he managed to just get 195,000 chat. Although this allowed him to pay off his debt, he had by then invested even more labor caring for the swine, and the added interest significantly eroded what remained of his profit. Perhaps if he had held out longer, but in any case, it was now April, the hottest month of the year, and that pig might well have been dead of heat stroke within a month. Now, let us turn to consider a young man named Zaw. By the age of 10, Zaw was a bonded laborer. Although he had not yet finished 5th grade, even he could see that his parents were in dire straits. At the time, Zaw's father, Mr. Lin, had intermittent work on assorted casual jobs while his mother would pick wild water spinach from roadside ditches to sell at the market. Their household was 500,000 chat in debt, and a doctor had recently diagnosed Mr. Lin with asthma, which severely constrained his capacity to work. It was around this time that a neighbor told Zaw's parents that her own son had obtained a job at a tea shop not too far away, and that Zaw could work there too if they so desired. Before the week was out, Mr. Lin had withdrawn his son from school, handed him over to the tea shop owner, and accepted 35,000 chat, or about $27 Singaporean, in return. This was a 1-month advance on Zaw's future salary. Subsequently, the employer was keen to give Zaw's father regular 5-month advances. The boss was satisfied he had a worker who wouldn't run away, Mr. Lin recalls. These larger advances also meant that Zaw's father only had to travel to the tea shop once every 5 months to collect the money and to see the boy. As far as Zaw reckoned, this was Jesu set, repaying a debt of gratitude to one's parents. Admittedly, there were times he wanted to run home during those first months, particularly when his boss yelled at him or smacked him on the head for a mistake he had made, but eventually Zaw accommodated himself to tea shop life. In any case, his boss was not nearly as nasty as some others he had heard of. Each morning, having slept about 4 hours, Zaw would wake at 3 a.m. His duties were initially limited to tidying up, washing dishes, and waiting tables, but over the years, he was 17 when I met him, he has learned additional skills such as brewing tea and baking flatbread. He gets several hours off in the afternoon when customers are scarce, and he uses this time to catch up on sleep. Work continues from the moment he wakes until the shop closes at around 10 p.m. Although he has never gotten a regular day off, the tea shop owner does let him take 4 days each year to visit his family. Over the years, Zaw's salary has risen, but it has scarcely outpaced inflation. He presently gets, along with room and board, 80,000 chat per month, which means his father collects regular 5-month advances of 400,000 chat. No cash ever passes through Zaw's hands. Mr. Lin, who no longer works, puts the money towards the household budget or uses it to pay off recurring debts. Were Zaw to quit his job, he would have to repay or work off this advance in full before the employer would allow him to leave. In this way, Zaw remains bonded by debt to his employer, a condition he has never successfully left in over 7 years. Now, the arrangement in which Zaw labored is not in Myanmar exceptional. Research on human trafficking in the country points to an increase in parents brokering their children's entry into labor bondage, this as a response to growing poverty and debt. According to the International Labor Organization, there are an estimated 1.2 million child laborers in Myanmar, aged 5 to 17, who work on average 52 hours per week, typically in conditions of debt bondage. Now, as Zaw saw it, the reason his boss opted to employ children was clear. Lower wages aside, the issue was one of discipline. Adults don't concentrate on their work, he explained. They always want to go out. Children aren't like that. The owner just has to yell and the children get scared and won't want to go out. The employer can control child workers and he doesn't let them go out. When they're not on duty, he makes them sleep and he makes them stay in the tea shop. Of course, Zaw's conditions of employment were in violation of Myanmar labor law. The 1951 Shops and Establishments Law, amended in 2016, prohibits tea shops and other such establishments from employing children under the age of 14 and requires a certificate of medical fitness, which Zaw did not possess, for child workers aged 14 and above. This same law restricts overtime to employees 16 years of age or older, requires that any such overtime be voluntary, and obliges employers to schedule at least 1 day off per week as compared to Zaw's 4 days off per year. Moreover, even factoring in deductions for room and board, Zaw's monthly salary of 80,000 chat falls well short of the legal minimum, 4,800 chat per day as of March 2018. He received as well no additional pay for his many hours of overtime. Now, let us consider Auntie Cho. Of her daughter's new earrings, Auntie Cho was proud, this despite the debt. Other children have earrings, she explained, seated cross-legged on the bamboo slatted floor of her home. I felt bad my daughters had nothing to wear. True, her eldest had worn earrings in the past, but Auntie Cho had sold that pair to cover the cost of 2 funerals. Her sister and mother-in-law having died the year prior within 3 months of each other, and funerals are expensive. Those earrings had not been worth nearly enough. That is why she had borrowed an additional 160,000 chat from Mr. Arul, who owned the waste purchasing depot where Auntie Cho sold the assorted plastics, metals, and cardboard that she and her husband collected, items that Mr. Arul would resell to recycling plants where they would be broken down and resold domestically or exported as production materials to industrial manufacturers in China. Mr. Arul, a Hindu and ethnic Tamil, was patient and good-natured, Auntie Cho remarked, her broad grin suggesting her sincerity. Not only had Mr. Arul been willing to lend her the money interest-free, he had not even fixed a repayment schedule. He merely deducted manageable repayment amounts from the total he paid to Auntie Cho and her husband each week for the items that they brought him for resale. Mr. Arul's generosity notwithstanding, Auntie Cho did not seek to drag out repayment. She paid off the debt within 4 months. Out of debt since last year, Auntie Cho felt it appropriate to borrow once again from Mr. Arul, this time 120,000 chat for 2 pairs of gold earrings. Like this, Auntie Cho was back in debt. But it did not much worry her. Of course, the debt added to her obligation to sell to Mr. Arul even when another depot was offering a better price, but she was under this obligation anyway since it was a condition of using the metal collection cart that Mr. Arul lent her free of charge. In any case, she would not even consider selling her items elsewhere, and she had never once done so in the 2.5 years she had worked collecting discarded items. Since the start, she had only ever sold to Mr. Arul, even though there were, according to Mr. Arul himself, about 30 waste purchasing depots in the township. Some collectors, of course, were disloyal, according to Auntie Cho, and despite using a cart from one depot, they would surreptitiously sell their items to another depot that was offering a higher rate. But such individuals were rare. As for Auntie Cho, her relationship with Mr. Arul was based, she felt, on understanding, trust, and loyalty. It would be inappropriate to sell elsewhere. And on this matter, Mr. Arul, seated at a wooden desk behind a mountain of plastic water bottles at his purchasing depot some weeks later, concurred. We've grown close, he explained, regarding his relationship with the individuals to whom he lent his 14 collection carts. They would never sell elsewhere. Now, the arrangement in place here, as both Auntie Cho and Mr. Arul acknowledged, is one of monopsony, a market that is with but a single buyer. Relations of this sort have been similarly documented among informal waste collectors elsewhere. It is due to their monopsonistic character that such arrangements have come to be labeled disguised wage labor. For in such cases, seemingly self-employed producers otherwise free to sell their wares on the open market have become bound, as though employees, to a single purchaser who is able to set the price of sale. Unlike formal employment, however, labor protection laws regarding workers' compensation, social security, or the minimum wage, for example, have no purchase here. To be sure, informal waste collectors are not everywhere bound by such obligations. And where expectations of this sort exist, collectors may decide to covertly sell their wares elsewhere, refusing thereby the monopsonistic relationship that is being imposed. Such was the case with the migrant waste collectors that I previously studied in the Thai border town of Mae Sot. Now, given the possibility of transgression, depot owners like Mr. Arul have endeavored to cultivate committed relationships with the waste collectors on whose labor they depend. Thus, Mr. Arul lent out his collection carts free of charge and offered microcredit free of interest. In response, both parties came to see their relationship as based on understanding, loyalty, and trust. A business relationship, to be sure, but also one that was inseparably an ethical relation of mutual obligation. Consequently, any attempt to account for this relationship in exclusively economistic or alternatively moral terms would be reductive as well as erroneous. Now, it has been a standard anthropological move since Malinowski's Trobriand intervention to critique economistic accounts of human social interaction. In this Malinowskian spirit, anthropologists have variously framed the cultural dimension of economic life in terms more or less synonymous of E.P. Thompson's moral economy, Karl Polanyi's embeddedness, or Marcel Mauss's gift exchange. A common anthropological understanding has seen moral economy, the embedded economy, and gift economies as operating outside, autonomous, or interstitial to the depersonalized market rationale that presumably characterizes capitalism, the household as opposed to the market, for example. More recent theoretical interventions, however, have critiqued this opposition that pits moral economy against political economy. In this critical perspective, moral economy does not delineate an extra-capitalist realm. It simply labels in a capitalist context political economy's ideological dimension, the particular value judgments and moral claims that inform everyday economic behavior. So too, debt is never just an economic relation. Notwithstanding coercive enforcement of financial contracts, monetary debt always rests on the moral claim of an obligation to repay. That is why financial markets require constant ideological work, the labor of legitimation without which such markets would break down. In this respect, financial debts and moral obligations operate in mutually constitutive registers rather than according to their own autonomous logics. And now for my final illustration, let us turn to Brother Min. Employed for the moment as a stevedore, Brother Min was paid by the sack, 100 chat for each 50-kilogram gunny of dried corn that he carried from the ship in the dock to the truck in the lot. But hardly 5 minutes into the job, and the labor boss had instructed them all to wait. The cause of the delay being the seemingly inexplicable fact that the truck currently being loaded was not in fact the correct recipient of the corn. The driver was thus presently on the phone with his boss trying to figure out how he could have possibly ended up at the wrong pier. By this point, Brother Min, who was killing time oscillating between jocular banter and indignant complaint, had carried exactly 2 sacks, and thus exactly 200 chat in earnings, precisely enough for a single cup of instant coffee or 2 sticky rice fritters such as his mother, Auntie San, was at that very moment selling to the idle stevedores lounging around her bamboo tray in the shade of another truck parked in the lot. Then all of a sudden, Brother Min went off. "I've got a son to feed," the 24-year-old father yelled in a moment of indignation as if to no one in particular. Now, when Brother Min had woken up that morning, lying on a mat rolled out on the floor of his home in the Yadna squatter settlement next to his wife of 3 years and their 18-month-old son, he had not known that he would later be loading sacks of dried corn onto a 22-wheeled tractor trailer parked at Mr. Kin's Riverside Depot. He had not in fact known whether he would be working at all that day. That is because Brother Min was the type of employee who Mr. Kin referred to as an outside worker, the type who showed up looking for work in the morning, got paid cash in hand when the job was done, and left with no commitment on the part of the employer for any subsequent employment. True, Brother Min had worked for Mr. Kin on and off over the preceding 4 months, but then again he had also worked for several other depots up and down the riverside, loading and unloading sacks of gravel, rice, dried corn, or what have you. Like this, Brother Min's employment under Mr. Kin had been long-term, but casual. Intermittent, in other words, as opposed to permanent. As such, the work in question was not covered by various labor laws. Brother Min received no guaranteed minimum wage, for instance, nor could he claim legislated compensation for arbitrary dismissal or seek subsidized medical coverage at the township's Social Security hospital. In this respect, his employment was de jure informal. Now, at the very moment that Brother Min was idling in frustration amid the confusion of the erroneous corn load, Brother Nai was unloading sacks of rice from a different truck at a factory elsewhere in the industrial zone. Yet this man too was employed by Mr. Kin, who had dispatched the delivery truck in question. Brother Nai, however, had worked at the depot for the past 9 years, ever since he was 15 years old. He was also significantly an inside worker, the type who resided in on-site worker housing, the type who needed to request permission to take a day off, the type who had responsibility for transferring from truck to ship the near daily deliveries of putrid slurry discharged as a byproduct of rice-based alcohol production from distilleries elsewhere in the zone, which someone had figured out could be used as a cheap fish food substitute in the delta's many aquaculture ponds. And that's what's being stored in the sacks in the photo in front of you. Now, Mr. Kin, the depot owner, was an enlightened sort of fellow. Critical of military rule, he argued that the prevalence of alcoholism in present-day Myanmar was connected to the country's post-socialist transition and the military government's eagerness to profit off the sale of liquor licenses. He deplored as well the constrictive socioeconomic conditions in Myanmar, which had obliged most of his employees to drop out of school as children. He spoke of running a democratic workplace, which meant, he said, that he permitted stevedores living on site to take on additional piece rate work at depots elsewhere on the riverside. And he made a point of emphasizing that he helped workers injured on the job by contributing, out of his own goodwill, Zedana, to their medical expenses. Now here, Zedana is a colloquial usage of Pali Buddhist terminology, which marks the subject's virtuous character. Because Zedana is used in Myanmar to index the selfless volition underlying charity, or dana, the latter being one of 10 Theravada Buddhist paramis, or virtues, whose cultivation moves the agent that much closer to Nibbana, nirvana, the final and ultimate goal. In any case, at least some employees at the depot considered Mr. Kin good-natured, sekaunde, and confirmed that their boss did indeed contribute to the medical expenses of inside workers injured on the job. Putting aside, however, Mr. Kin's perceived generosity, workers employed inside remained informal, if only in practice. Crucially, their employer provided them with no written employment contract. They were paid out on a piece rate at the end of the day, but were not guaranteed the legal daily minimum wage, a fact that left them with little or no earnings on days when deliveries were scarce. Their employer had also not registered them with the Social Security Board, as is required by the 2012 Social Security Law. Such registration would have obliged Mr. Kin to contribute the additional value of 3% of each worker's monthly earnings to the government's Social Security Hospital. In addition, although inside workers had in the past been dismissed for inconsistent work practices, none of these individuals had ever received severance pay, as is legally required by the 2013 Employment and Skills Development Law and the Notification of Severance Payment number 84, 2015. And finally, although Mr. Kin construed his contributions to workers' medical expenses as acts of generosity, he was in fact legally obligated under the 1923 Workmen's Compensation Act, amended in 2005, to compensate workers for on-the-job injuries. This was a legal requirement that Mr. Kin never acknowledged. In practice, it was the workers themselves who covered the bulk of their medical expenses, using to do so a collective fund to which inside workers regularly contributed. The employer's contribution was never more than a quarter of total medical costs. But what about Mr. Kin's claim of running a democratic workplace? That's nonsense, alaga, rebutted Mr. San with a dismissive wave of his hand. The incredulous respondent here was a resident of the depot's on-site accommodations, where he lived with his son, a stevedore in Mr. Kin's employ. If a worker isn't present when a ship arrives, explained Mr. San, the boss would just fire him and then kick him out of the worker housing. What we see, therefore, among stevedores employed at Mr. Kin's Riverside Depot are two types of employment arrangements. Workers here are segmented between those living on-site and those living off-site, the latter residing almost exclusively in the neighboring Yadna squatter settlement. Of course, the literature on informal labor has often highlighted such employment segmentation, where casual workers excluded from legal labor protections are intermittently employed to flexibly complement a relatively stable, formally employed workforce. And the fact that inside workers had more employment security than outside workers was something that Mr. Kin readily acknowledged. Yet, it was not formal from informal workers that labor segmentation in this case bifurcated, because all of these workers were in practice informal. Segmentation instead divided outside workers who had unambiguously casual employment from inside workers who had relative job security, but whose employment conditions remained de facto informal and in certain respects casual as well, or at least irregular, since the piece rate labor was inconsistent while dismissal without compensation was an ever-present possibility. Overlaid upon this informal employment arrangement was a local variant in a Buddhist idiom of what in recent years has become a globally prominent ideology of ethical capitalism. For the non-unionized workforce at Mr. Kin's depot, marginal employment security and partial financial support to treat on-the-job injuries were construed as conditional on the arbitrary generosity of a capitalist patron instead of on the judicial enforcement of existing labor legislation. And in this respect, Mr. Kin's depot was not unique. Political scientist Gerard McCarthy has convincingly argued that Myanmar's post-1988 military government encouraged Buddhist notions of Vedana, goodwill, and Dana, charity, while underscoring the meritorious implications ensuing therefrom as means of domestically legitimizing crony capitalism while funding infrastructure development through well-publicized private donations in the absence of an effective system of formal taxation. Along similar lines, anthropologist Sohini Kar argues in her study of financial lending in the slums of northern Kolkata that the Indian government has promoted microcredit within a discourse of ethical capitalism and financial inclusion while simultaneously slashing budgets for public services. The effect has been to offload the burden of structural poverty onto the shoulders of the newly financialized poor. More globally, capitalist institutions and financial elites have, in the face of surging economic inequality and popular demands for redistributive taxation, instead advocated philanthropy and ethical capitalism, which would render such redistribution an arbitrary expression of elite generosity rather than a political obligation grounded in the popular will. In a more theoretical vein, anthropologists have often celebrated moral economies and gift economies as humanizing alternatives to the calculating and self-serving materialism commonly associated with market calculus. And at Mr. Kin's Riverside Depot, there was indeed a moral economy of sorts, as expressed through the ethical idiom through which the latter construed his relations with his employees. This moral economy, however, was the legitimizing pretense for employment outside existing labor protection laws. The workers here remained precarious, while their employer pursued a fraught micro-hegemony over his workforce. So, the cases of Uncle Win, Zaw, Auntie Cho, Brother Min, and Brother Nai that I've recounted to you illustrate some of the varied arrangements in which Yadna's residents labored. These arrangements are not the sort of good formal sector jobs that the World Bank identified as the reward of unrestricted private investment and capitalist transformation. And yet, the individuals I've spoken about were also not outside of Myanmar's so-called transition. Stated otherwise, this situation is not transitional. It is the destination. I will add that even in garment factories producing for export, workers confront various violations of labor law that renders such labor informal in practice, if not in law. Now, I'd like to conclude my talk with 2 points. First, in order to better understand the precarious conditions of rural to urban migrants living and working on Yangon's industrial periphery, we need to recognize that such labor is underpinned by a relatively recent history of rural dispossession and the conditions of extreme market dependence that such dispossession has engendered for affected individuals. Consequently, ongoing struggles against dispossession in rural Myanmar are critical for addressing the precarious conditions of rural to urban migrants around Yangon and other urban areas in the country. Second, so-called formal sector employment is not an automatic outcome of capitalist transformation, despite what the World Bank claims. And it is not a given that so-called formal sector employers will follow formal, that is, legally stipulated labor standards. Instead, adherence to labor law often depends on collective struggles by affected workers. Where such collective struggles are absent, the so-called formal sector is quite often informal in practice, in violation, that is to say, of legislated labor standards. Worker organizing and workplace struggles are thus critical for addressing the precarious labor arrangements of individuals living and working on Yangon's industrial outskirts. Now, I will add in closing that these 2 observations help us understand why the current struggle against the reimposition of military rule in Myanmar is not for most people an elitist project of simply reinstalling Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD into power. Instead, for individuals such as those residing at the Yadna squatter settlement, the struggle against military rule is very much about immediate material concerns. Simply put, the reimposition of direct military rule and martial law over the industrial zones around Yangon have severely constrained workers' abilities to collectively organize to contest their low wages and precarious conditions of labor. And it has also constrained the abilities of rural dwellers to contest the theft of their land by military and corporate actors. For outside observers seeking to understand the ongoing struggle against military rule in Myanmar, I therefore encourage a closer focus on the struggles and material concerns of ordinary people across the country, such as the low-income residents of the Yadna squatter settlement. And on that point, I will bring my talk to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for the wonderful talk. Yeah, it's a very rich account of various issues in Myanmar. including rural to urban migrant workers, informal workers, and also the financial debt issues also linked to global capital. So now I understand why you use a quote in your title, the title of your talk, the transitional. So it's kind of against the idea about the transitional proposed by the World Bank, whether it will be transitional to the formal, more and more workers will be transitioned to formal sectors. Yeah, I think now the floor is open. Please raise your question. I get 2 questions, I think, in the chat. Okay, from Xingyan. The first question is, could you please explain more about the meaning of land confiscation? Did the rural household receive any compensations? Who are the landowners? Meaning, who? I don't know what Xingyan means. Whether do you mean it's who owns the land, or by the villagers, or actually by the community, or by actually sometimes they're like ambiguous kind of land rights there. Second question is, do you think a formal labor market is possible in the future? I think that's the core of your talk. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so for land confiscation, there is a diversity of ways in which this happens in Myanmar. So I'm primarily working on drawing on the work of quite a lot of scholars and civil society organizations who have documented this. So if you're interested, I recommend the work of people like Sue Mark and Kevin Woods, for example. But all civil society organizations like the Karen Human Rights Group have done excellent work in documenting land confiscation. So in some cases, it's simply military goes in and takes the land. In some cases, this has been quite brutal in the upland areas with kind of scorched earth campaigns. In the lowlands, this happens in ways that where certain land that is untitled is not recognized as having ownership, even though there is traditional or customary land tenure. And so because that's not recognized, the claim is that it's not in fact dispossession or theft because there's no owner. In other cases, there has been compensation. One prominent case was the Thilawa industrial zone south of Yangon, where there was compensation given. However, many of the villagers who were living there beforehand felt that the compensation was much too low, and indeed it was far below the value of the land. So one of the, I think, important things to highlight with regard to dispossession of is that there is this diversity of ways that this happens. Yeah, so the other question is
whether it will be possible in the future for a formal labor market for these workers.
Yeah, well, I think actually one of the my arguments is that yes, there is not necessarily for these workers, but there is structurally kind of a necessity to have simultaneously formal and informal labor arrangements, because formal labor, understood in terms of legally labor that meets legal standards, the minimum wage and such, is used in a way we can say it's part of a hegemonic project of incorporating certain sections of the population into a political order. But the political order and the political economic order cannot afford to incorporate everybody. And so there's always this exclusion. But the claim that it's possible, or that there's the possibility of everyone being included, is, I think, a necessary political claim that has to be made in order to get people to buy in to the political economic order and the transition in Myanmar, but a political economic order in other countries as well. So I think there's always going to be simultaneously formal and informal labor arrangements that work together kind of in a mutually constitutive relationship.
Great. I received another question. So asking about the cases you introduced during your talk. It seems all the cases are male. So I'm sure you interviewed a lot of females, how the the female, the migrants and their families fit into the narrative of your research?
Okay, excellent question. So the third case was a woman, Auntie Cho. So there are women engaged in these sorts of informal labor arrangements that I've talked about, specifically the waste collection. But in the industrial zones, one of the important gender dynamics is that garment factory employment is open to young women, but largely barred to men. So 90% of workers in the garment factories are women. And this is seen as, for many people, not all, but for many people, relatively preferable because it's a stable, not necessarily higher, but a stable form of employment. So many young women try to get that work. So for that reason, there's a disproportionate amount of women in the garment sectors, whereas for the kind of portering work that I talked about, the stevedore, the carrying of those sacks, it's disproportionately men, except in the case of gravel and stone and brick yards, in which case they hire everybody, including children. And for waste collection, it's quite mixed. And so there are various ways in which, although for child workers, both young women and men are kind of underage or under 18 have said that they feel that they have a debt to their parents that they have to repay. But it does seem that there's more pressure, or at least more commitment to this obligation from many of the women. So that is another kind of factor that's informing some of their engagement in labor processes. But there's a lot more to be said about the gender dynamics.
Actually, I have a question of my own. So you talk about this, how this global financial capital is linked to this informal economy in Myanmar. So in the literature of land dispossessions, I think a lot of focus is placed on this foreign capital invested in like Myanmar or in other Southeast Asian countries. For example, the capital from China, capital from Thailand, as you mentioned. So how this foreign capital actually has impact this informal arrangement of their jobs and also their land, the pace of their land dispossession and also their struggles.
Well, there have been some cases like the one I mentioned at the beginning, the Lepadon case, which was this joint venture between the Chinese copper company and the military company. So in cases like that, there's a kind of joint operations between foreign capital investment and local. And that in other cases, there's a lot of like working through the military. I think there's a lot of kind of indirect ways in which foreign capital goes, as opposed to having a foreign company coming in and doing kind of confiscation work. But in a place like the Thilawa industrial zone, that was largely a Japanese-funded project by a lot of large Japanese corporations to establish this industrial zone south of Yangon. But the work of setting it up and removing people who were living there was carried out by local authorities. So those are two cases where the foreign capital has been involved. The relationship to informal labor, I think, is really interesting, and that's closer to my own direct research, is that in a lot of the garment sector factories that are producing for export, there tends to be a higher likelihood that people are going to be paid the minimum wage. Not always. They're not always paid the minimum wage, but it's more likely in the garment sector. Although there's a host of other laws that are often violated and frequently violated in these factories that are producing these for name brand exports. But there's a kind of relative way in which there's more adherence. But even for kind of so-called formal sector factories, they often rely on informal arrangements. And one of the examples that I draw on in the book is this sawdust trade that's used as an upstream industry. So this a group of workers who are living in the settlement, they would go out to a sawmill and buy the sawdust from the sawmill and then take it to factories and sell it at the factories. And the factories would use it as fuel, of boiler fuel, for the production of things like cardboard boxes or tofu. And so you would have this so-called formal sector factory that was dependent on informal an informal economy and informal labor arrangements. So that's one way in which the formal and informal are in this kind of mutually constitutive relationship.
Okay, there's several questions in the chat. So I'm going to read them, and so you can think about your answer. I think the first two questions from Ivan, I think resonate with most of us here. Thank you for this. My question is, what do you see as the key political institutions for the dispossessed seeking justice going forward? The NLD, as you outlined, have been pro-neoliberal for the last decade. Is there any chance they will reform internally in the coming years with regard to labor and land and extraction, of course, assuming they come back to power? Okay. Similarly, outside of opposing the coup, where does the political energy of the students who say there is no supreme server to go? So I also understand that such questions may be moot at this time due to the ongoing coup situation. It's just like, speculate on what is going to happen next.
Well,
so what about I read one more question, then you can think about them together. Okay. This question is from Gerald McCarthy. Thanks for a rich and fascinating presentation. In view of the precarity back into the political economy before the coup, how do your interlocutors view demands for total economic closure and shuttering of all factories to heighten the pressure on the junta and hasten the path to negotiation and systemic change? So whether this, particularly this radical and the repression, shutting down all the factories whether this will accelerate the change in the future. Yes.
Okay. Can I respond now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the first one, two really important questions, and I think they're actually related. So I think going forward, I cannot in any way make any prediction about what's happening. There's so much that's fluid and changing on the ground, and I wouldn't be so brash as to make kind of a presumption there. But I do think that whatever happens, I think people are showing on the ground that this sort of forms of autonomous self-organization and struggle that have developed, that were there before the coup and have continued to develop since the coup, those are the forms in which responses to dispossession, I think, can most effectively play out. I'm not confident that an institution, a political institution, that is not facing organized pressure from below, I'm not confident that it would do anything to substantially deal with dispossession. And this also relates to the second question about there is no supreme savior and the students and others who are organizing. I think that that's also part of a recognition that these institutions, these formal institutions, have done so little to seriously address issues of social justice regarding land and labor, that there's this need for autonomous self-organization. And so I think that going forward, that's what I would keep my eye out for in terms of the kind of the most effective forms in which this sort of struggle will take place. But definitely two really important questions. For Gerard's question, I think, although it doesn't say it, I'm curious, I think it might be referring to a call for sanctions. There have been kind of talk about this. This is something, it's a very, I think, difficult question because some of the labor groups have come out quite strongly in favor of sanctions. And whereas it's very difficult, I think other workers in the industrial zones have very valid concerns about their immediate livelihood. And so because it's so difficult, like it's, in hindsight, it depends what happens going forward, that maybe you could say in hindsight whether such a thing would be a good idea or not, because I think at the moment, it's not for me to say one way or the other about the appropriateness of sanctions or not. I think that's that's entirely for the workers in Myanmar to make claims about. but it's an important issue for sure.
Yeah, indeed, there are a lot of possibilities going forward. Now, the next three questions, I think the first two questions are about the facts. The first question is from Claudia Chua. I think she asked about whether you mentioned this World Bank's inaccurate depiction in the descriptions in Myanmar. What about other countries? Whether the World Bank also have like similar narrative in other countries? For example, you also focus on Thailand, right? The second question from Ling Li Huang. She compared Myanmar and China. So China has this hukou system dividing residents into rural and urban areas. So if you have the kind of hukou you have will also determine all your rights and benefits. So she's asking whether there are similar systems or policies in Myanmar affecting or kind of outlining people's rights and benefits. The third question is more theoretical, so from Dominic. So I think I ask about you talk about this dichotomy between moral economy, gig economy, and the market economy. So I think you want to hear more about it. So again, more about this, like examples about this dichotomy, and also your critique of this dichotomy. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe first, Claudia, yes. Next question. I think maybe just as a kind of a short, there's a lot to say, but I think the World Bank is invested in a particular understanding of development that's non-conflictual. That's based on kind of this harmonious understanding of development processes. And I think that leads to a lot of erroneous claims about development processes, because there's an unwillingness to deal with the fact that there's a lot of conflict in development processes, that economic growth is not a kind of a neutral process. It benefits some more than others, and sometimes benefits some to the detriment of others. And I think that we have seen that in many countries, and what they've done in many countries. So I'll just move on. The second one regarding the hukou system, there is not a formal analogy to the hukou in Myanmar, but there's sort of a de facto situation where the rural to urban migrants, especially if they end up in these informal settlements, are kind of de facto excluded from a lot of processes, because a lot of rights, because many of them have lost their national registration cards, which are needed for various services. And for example, many of the residents of the settlement where I did research were endured this 2008 Cyclone Nargis in the Delta, and lost a lot of their personal documents then. So when they came to the city, they did not have this, and this has inhibited their ability to make claims in the city. So there's sort of a de facto division, but not formalized in the way that the hukou system does. And Dominique's question. So rather than, my argument is that, and it kind of parallels my argument with the formal informal dichotomy, is that on one level, it's useful to note these distinctions, but on a deeper level, that's the relations that these are referring to are in fact very intertwined. So that in the case of, for example, the Riverside Depot, whereas a lot of, I guess, anthropologists have said, try to kind of look at, argue that it's an argument against kind of the homo economicus, or that the kind of capitalist market relations dominate everything. So if that's the sort of totalizing idea, then there's a search for this alternative, pure space of kind of ethical, non-market relations. And so there has been a tendency to dichotomize these two. But what we've seen in many cases, not just Myanmar, is that, in fact, capitalist processes work through moral claims. So in the case of the depot, they're working below what they should be paid, and they're not getting their legal rights, but the employer is making claims of obligation and such. And similarly in garment factories, I talked to some women who worked in garment factories who would say that the supervisor would say, okay, we're going to have overtime, but you're not getting paid. But come on, let's do this together. And so in some cases, there was this way in which people would get enrolled in working without pay. So the argument that the only reason they're working is monetary is not held up here, but the factory operates in this way. So what I'm arguing is that they're very much intertwined, that the moral economy claims are very much intertwined with the political economy, rather than treating them as distinct separate spheres. Okay.
We have another question here from Shannon Lung. Hi, Stephen. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Lots to think about. I was curious about the relationship between migration route and the labor arrangements you discussed. So many of the cases you discuss began at the point when migrants already reached their destination. The question is, to what extent were migrants aware of these labor arrangements before entering the squatter settlement? Could you say more about how the experience of migration matters to migrants and the types of struggle they engage in? So I think the question is trying to ask you how to connect the pre-migration experience and the post-migration struggle and experience.
Okay, so in some cases, people have some sense of what's available in the city, and that's part of why they've come. Some people have family members who have previously migrated. I did some oral histories with people about their migration experiences. And some people would talk about how they had like an older brother who had gone there first, who told them, okay, there's work available. So I don't think people, at least the people that I spoke to, were under the illusion that this was somehow this wonderful world of high-paid, kind of cozy employment. People were, I think, at least the people I spoke to had quite sober awareness of the limits of this. But many of them were coming from a situation that was even more dire. There are people who left, for example, after Cyclone Nargis, there was nothing there. Other people who lost their land, some people, for example, who had been agricultural workers, and suddenly there was just no work at all. So it wasn't so much that they had imagined this great employment situation and they got there and realized, oh, it wasn't what they expected. It's just that given what they were coming from, it was a relatively better option. But there were other cases where people I spoke to imagined that things were a bit different, especially with the garment sector. I spoke with some people who because the garment factories are often treated as kind of a relatively privileged employment opportunity. So many of the young women would rather say that they want to work in a garment factory rather than, for example, collecting waste for resale. But I talked to some people who said, oh, that's what I thought. And then I started working there and I realized that actually it's not great in the factories. There's all of these other problems. So they're in that sense that what they had imagined beforehand was different than what they came to see. So I'm not.
Okay, we have another question here from Andrew. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. It was really interesting to think about the dispossession without development. I think this is a term used in the literature. There seems to be some kind of salvaging, like waste collection, sawdust collection in the kinds of informal jobs that migrants or the dispossessed are doing, which contrasts against garment production or factories as the units of capitalist production. So it's like informal, more like formal organization, right? I was wondering if you could talk a little more about this contrast and also what your correspondents feel about these jobs and how has it affected their aspirations?
Okay. So maybe there are, I suppose that you can distinguish if you want the sort of salvage work and the non, as opposed to the employment. But part of what, I don't want to be too dichotomous by mapping the salvage work on top of informal and employment on top of formal, because that's part of the dichotomy that I'm critiquing, because a lot of the employment is also informal. But nonetheless, there is some interesting salvage work. The waste collection is one. The sawdust, not so much because they're buying the sawdust, but another one that came up was Earthworm Collection. So there's a large export of eels to China, to Yunnan. And so what happens is people in the settlement would go out to various locations and dig up worms, collect worms, and take them to an eel trader who would pay them for these worms, and then would take the worms and would give them to eel catchers who would use the worms as bait, would go out and trap eels, and this is also a salvaging in a way. The eels would be collected in sort of roadside ditches because they're quite common during the rainy season, and then would go and sell this back to the depot, the eel depot. And what's interesting is, similar to the waste collection, there was a monopsonistic relationship in that the worm collectors and the eel collectors were bound to the depot. So they had to sell to the depot because they were in debt to the depot owner. So this is a way in which this sort of informal salvage work, which looks like it's sort of self-employment, independent self-employment, is in fact very much bound up with this trading, which in turn kind of enters into a formal economy along the way through trade and such. And I do have a separate critique, if you're familiar, because you raised the question of the term salvage, is that one prominent case is Anna Singh's book about Matsutake mushroom collection. She uses a salvage term quite prominently. And so I do have a kind of a critique of the way that she does present this as an autonomous form of livelihood that is not controlled by capital or by employers. At least in the cases that I looked at, that was not the case. People were very much under the control of these depots who could say, you're not allowed to take a day off, even though they're technically, or in a way, independent catchers of eels. The depot owner would be able to say, you better go out and collect eels today. You're not allowed to take a day off. And you can use the fact of a debt to enforce that in a manner akin to employment.
Thank you, Stephen. So I think in the literature, there's a term called informalization of formal sector. I think now you give another term, is formalization of informal sector, which is quite insightful. I think now is about time for us to end this seminar. Please join me, give Stephen another applause for his wonderful talk and his response in Q&A. Thank you all for your participation. I wish you, everyone, I wish you a nice weekend ahead. Okay.
And thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who attended.
Okay, thank you. Okay, see you all.